Welcome to the But She's Your Mother podcast, where we talk about all things related to being raised by narcissistic parents. Our guests are adult survivors of child abuse. Please note that this podcast is intended for mature audiences and may feature topics such as emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, domestic violence, self-harm, suicide, murder, and eating disorders. Opinions expressed by guests and survivors are their own. Some names may be changed or blocked out to protect minors, victims, and survivors. Thank you for listening to But She's Your Mother, the podcast. Today, our guest is Lisa Johnson. Lisa Johnson is a survivor of a toxic marriage who took her experience and decided that she would help other people get out of toxic marriages and figure out ways to, I don't want to say co-parent, share parenting, because there's no co-parenting with someone who's narcissistic. A lot of sibling survivors end up going into toxic marriages or end up being married to narcissists because of the fact that when you are raised in a narcissistic family system, the love you know is the love that you gravitate towards, love, right? And so the love that a child growing up in one of those systems grows to know is a love that's associated with toxic behaviors and abuse. So without further ado, I would like you to meet Lisa. This is her story.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I was in a toxic marriage and relationship for 20 years. I have two grown kids, and they have been pretty much no contact with their father for about 8-ish years.
Welcome to But She's Your Mother podcast. I know I laugh every time I say it too, but that's what we hear throughout our lives. So there you go. It made sense to me. Lisa, tell me a little bit of background. Like, how did you meet your ex and how did you end up getting married to him?
Okay, so shortly after I graduated college, I backpacked around Europe by myself. And then I came back and thought, I should settle down with the real job. And then that didn't really stick for more than 9 months. And I ended up moving back to Europe with my heavy metal rock guitarist boyfriend for a year and realized this is not working either. I really need to grow up. And when I get back to America, I'm going to stop dating men, children, and start dating grown men. And so that year in Hungary, where we lived and taught was excellent, but very difficult. And we were poor because at the time it was right after communism left. And so part of me coming back to America was like having no money, no job, and thinking, I've had enough of this. I really need a more stable life. And so I started getting more stable life. But before that, my boyfriend said, oh, I know this guy and he's really nice and he owns property and I think he'll rent us a place for a good price. And I'd met him before. And so he introduced us and the guy did rent us one of his properties. And that was my future ex-husband. So my future ex-husband was my landlord. And when we first got back from Hungary, we had lived in a little village, nobody spoke English. I'm a major reader. And my ex, the heavy metal rock guitarist guy, was not a reader. My future ex-husband was very academic, very intellectual. And so the first thing that drew me to him, I was not physically attracted to him ever, was that he was a major reader. And he was 7 years older and he had this stable career and he had these properties. And even though I wasn't physically attracted to him, I was like, he seems like a nice guy. I insisted that when we paid the rent, we paid and got a receipt because we had a problem in college with that. So I saw him like once a month for several months, just talk briefly. The old boyfriend was like sort of friendly with him. And we went to a party at one point. Everybody else got drunk except for me and the future ex-husband. We had a very nice conversation on a couch where I was like, oh my gosh, this guy seems like so sweet and what a good listener and how understanding. And then a few months after that, I broke up with the guitarist guy and told the landlord I was moving out. And he was like, oh, do you want to have lunch sometime? So that began a very platonic relationship of just meeting and having lunch. And then one day we were in New York City where we live near, and going to a concert, and he was like, we should go away for the weekend. And I was kind of like, oh, well, we haven't even kissed or anything. And then we gradually started dating, but like I said, I was never physically attracted to him. And then I was going to move into New York City where I was teaching at the time. And he said, oh, you're going to end up with me anyway. So just move in with me. And there I was, installed in his house pretty quickly without ever thinking, what do I want? I was just sort of like, wow, here's this older man with this great job and properties, and I'm never going to be like poor, like I wasn't hungry, and he seemed so mature. So on paper, everything was perfect, even though something in me always was cringing at a lot of things that, there were other red flags. But that's basically 2 years later, we ended up getting married after a horrible, drawn out engagement. And then that's, the rest is a long story, as you can imagine.
So when you say after like a horrible 2-year drawn out engagement, was that like, were there like hot and cold things going on in that time, and like the mind games or?
Mind games.
Yeah.
Mind games. So again, I was really young. I think at the time I was like 23 or 24 and he was 30. And so he would say things like, the love bombing that happened in the beginning for me wasn't romantic. It was him taking me out to dinner and interviewing me early in the relationship. He said that he dated so many women, even though I was kind of like, I don't know why, but whatever. But that I was marriage material, that, I really stood out. He asked me very personal questions about my goals and my salary. And so I was very flattered by that. And then once I moved in with him, he used to say, you better get ready for when I'm going to ask you to marry me. Like he used to say, I'm going to get the ball rolling and you better get ready. And I never wanted to get married, but every single week it would be this thing of like, you better get ready. Like, I'm going to ask you to marry me. And then I started like getting really angry because I'd be like, why do you keep doing this? Why do you keep saying that you're going to ask? And again, not even thinking, but I don't really want to. But it became this thing of like, do what you said you're going to do. And then when he finally did ask for real, it's like a year and however long had passed. And he just kind of flung the ring at me. It was like, see, you happy now? He didn't get it sized. He didn't get it cleaned. It had been his grandmother. It was like, he never made any effort to do anything nice or special. It was like, ugh. And it was just miserable. There was a lot of crying in between.
It's interesting when all of that is happening because you're so young, because you're inexperienced, and because also I think that stability factor and the way that somebody like that leans in to really get to know you. And it feels so good because they're so interested, when what they're really doing is they're getting to know you so that they can weaponize the things that, are what they see as your wounds and your weaknesses, right?
Oh, yes. Yes. We talk about love bombing, how part of what people do is they keep you up late at night and having these very intimate conversations. Like, I've never told anybody this, but they're really getting information from you that they're going to use against you later, which of course my ex did.
Yeah. And I like that you are describing that part of love bombing. I think it's so important because when we hear love bombing, we tend to think candy and flowers. And that's not all of what love bombing is. It's grooming. What love bombing is grooming, right? And finding out what that other person needs from you in order to get them to lower their defenses and lean in and not really question anything. And then when you do question things, or you're recognizing, wait a minute, you said this, but you're doing that. My needs aren't really getting met. When you try to do that, they flip it around so quickly. It's crazy making, right? And then you're gaslighting yourself. So the next thing you know, 2 years later, you're getting married, even though you weren't even sure that's something that you wanted.
And I was never attracted to him.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah. But he gave you things that you needed or thought you needed in those moments. right? And you were at such a young age too, where you hadn't really started independently to provide your own stability. Like you were right there, and he got in, and I can see where that daylight was, right? Because there's safety in that, and we all want safety and stability regardless. And being so young and never really having, supplied that, because like you said, you were in Hungary, it was very impoverished, it was, a struggle there. So that was a lot for you. Like that was a big contrast of people and situation and lifestyle. So I can see how easy it was to lean into that, and why we would lean into something like, I've certainly done it. So thanks to like my mother, but she's your mother, right? So
sorry, Marnie, one of the things you said that I just have to add in about the part of the grooming process too was a lot of mirroring behavior. So when I came back from traveling all over, backpacking was my life, we got together and he made it seem like he loved travel. And he started taking me on these amazing vacations. Like we went to Mexico, we went to Italy, we traveled all over Europe, we went to visit my friends in Hungary. And so I thought that he had the same values as I did on top of the intellectual stuff. So I thought this is the perfect person for me, even though I'm not attracted to him. But there's these other things, you weigh, well, these are similar values, even though, of course, that fell apart after a short time.
Yeah. And, I mean, I think a lot of us, when we're talking about something as serious as moving in with someone or getting married, we're weighing, I hope, what looks like a good partner to us. Unfortunately, in these circumstances, because of age or traumatic background and things like that, we don't have the tools to measure what that really is, right? And we don't have a clear view on who a person is, because we're looking for the stuff that works.
Yeah. The other thing is, this was the only guy my mother ever approved of. She regretted that later, but there's a whole bunch of stuff there too.
Yeah, that doesn't, well, then if you're going to end it, right, there's pressure to stay in it because other people, particularly your mother, is approving of it. So it's like, well, maybe I'm being too hard on him, or something like that is probably going to be the language you're expecting to receive, whether or not that would be something that they would say to you. It might be different, right? So it sounds like it's changed during the engagement. How did it change after the marriage? Because I anticipate that there was another ball drop after he got you.
How did you know, Marty? Okay, so right after the wedding, I mean, I feel like it was the same summer that we got married. I went to visit a friend of mine for about 4 days. It must have been just weeks after we had gotten married. And I came back and found out that he was having an affair. And he's like, oh, I just met this woman in a parking lot, but I kept my wedding ring on and we only kissed and all that. And I was like, what? This is crazy. Like, we just got married. I'm done. I'm still young. Like, I am not continuing something like this. But part of the thing that was an issue with him was his mother had died before I met him. His mother had died when he was in his early 20s. And he had all this anger towards his dead mother. And I always would say, you think you maybe should go to some therapy with that, because she's dead and there's still this raging, like talking about her all the time. So when this happened, he said, no, please don't leave me. I promise I'll go to therapy and I'll deal with the stuff with my mother and I'm going to fix this. I can't lose you, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, oh my gosh, he would actually go to therapy for this. Like, he wouldn't go for the stuff with his mother. So, okay, I'll give him a chance and we'll see how things go. So, of course, with choosing the therapist, he said he had to choose the person, and the person he picked, he said he was impressed because he's usually smarter than everybody, but this therapist was pretty smart, like as smart as he was. So he was comfortable with her, and she had all these certifications and degrees. I wasn't even involved with that, but he started going to therapy for a couple of years, probably till just before we had our first child. And I just thought, okay, great. And the therapist supposedly told him, which he told me, that his issue was he wasn't getting his needs met, that he had a problem communicating. And so that he was learning how to tell me how to meet his needs better. And then that would solve everything. And so I just blissfully continued on for the next 18 years, thinking that he was fixed, even though, of course, there were other red flags throughout the relationship.
Wow. I love it when they use the therapist to manipulate their partner into doing what they want.
That was the same therapist that saw us at the end of the marriage, which is a whole other like why, but it
We'll get there.
So much worse.
We will get there. So when did you start having your children?
So let's see. So my son was born when I was 29. So it was a few more. It wasn't right after the marriage. So it was a few years into the marriage. And then my daughter was born 3 years later.
And what was he like as a father?
So that's the thing that also made it like, so I breastfed, but he never did. And he never did anything like every night. Like he never once helped with any of the feeding, even though I would have been happy to express milk and have him give the kids bottles. So everything was always on me, but he arranged his schedule. So he only worked a 4-day work week. And then on Fridays, he'd be home all the time. So he was physically present. And so all my friends were really jealous because they're like, you guys, like your husband's around, you're so lucky, but he didn't really help with stuff. And before the baby was born, everything was this disaster. Well, I have to say, Izzy was 3.5 weeks early, which none of us planned on. And I was a teacher. I was teaching high school and I taught right up until the Friday. And then Izzy was born in the middle of the night on a Monday, like Tuesday. So, but I kept saying like, we need to get ready for this baby. Like, can we clean it? Everything was always like a mess in the house. And he just never cared about anything to help or make it easier. It was more, I think, appearances, but I think that was what was so confusing for so many years too. In my head, I always thought he was a good father because he was physically there a lot, but looking back, he was never really emotionally present for our kids, which I didn't realize what my kids told me after the relationship ended. He had a very playful relationship with the kids. He would read to our son every night before he went to bed, which really had a wonderful impact on our son. And I'd read to my daughter. Like my son became a lifelong reader. So there were good things, but his whole thing was that his father was a really terrible father. And the most important thing to him was to be a better father than his father was. And so I think doing these appearances, if I'm going to be physically there, in his mind was enough.
Do you think that when he was sharing stories and experiences from his parents, he was doing that honestly, or was he doing that to gain sympathy from you? Like, I'm sure there was some genuine stuff in there because somebody doesn't become toxic in a vacuum, right? But we also know that toxic personalities will leverage other people's sympathies, right? And turn them into their therapist and that sort of thing. Were you experiencing that as well during the marriage?
So from the very beginning, he always referred to some kind of horrible abuse that he had experienced as a child, but he never made it clear exactly what it was. And no matter how many angles I'd approach it from, I never exactly knew what it was. He talked about his mother's rage. It sounded like there was some weird stuff with his father, but he always sort of excused his father, other than the father mainly abandoning him once the parents got divorced. But one thing that he always did, which used to drive me crazy, was whenever we'd be at a party, he would gravitate towards women and start talking about his abuse. And he'd try and be like, I need to find something I have in common. And sometimes there'd be my colleagues at parties. I'd be like, can you please not do that? Because it's like really inappropriate. But he'd always find a way to like connect with women who were emotionally damaged. And then it was almost like a competition with who's more abuse and let's bond. But it was always with women. And then with my friend's husband once, it was almost like this competition of who was abused worse. And it was just, I never understood it till after getting out of the marriage and realized like what kind of supply and also what a covert narcissist is. how they're not because I think there were other people in his immediate family who were overt, and I didn't know what narcissism was, but I was like, oh, that one's so full of themselves. But I never suspected that that might be his issue, because he was like quiet and vulnerable and sensitive, and he seemed like he was a good listener, but he actually wasn't paying attention to a lot of things. But he was presenting as that, like, oh, women really like me, because I'm so easygoing, and I'm like feminine in some ways. Like he would infiltrate all kinds of like women's things and make him like, I'm a feminist and women love me, and which made it all the worse.
Was he also doing that to create insecurity and jealousy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like one time before we got married, we had some of my teaching colleagues over, and I came in a few minutes late to our little party. And there was this girl that was like the last person I would expect anybody to flirt with. And he was like cozying up to her. They were like baking something together in the kitchen. And then I remember sitting around in the living room with our friends, or my friends. And then he was sitting next to this girl on the couch, and he was talking to her, and he put his hand on her leg. And I was like, what is he doing? And when I questioned him about it later, he's like, oh, you're so jealous. And then, but I think she was someone who people probably didn't give a lot of that type of attention to, because then she was really into it. And I remember a sense of cognitive dissonance, like this can't be happening, because why? But this is just so weird. And then he wouldn't admit it for a long time. But I think now looking back, he enjoyed getting me really confused and arguing with me about it. And then like a year later, he was like, oh, I apologize for that. Like, I knew I was wrong. I'm like, no, you never actually apologized for it. So it was like very, very confusing for me at the time.
Yeah, I mean, all roads lead back to emotional control, right? And they get a sense of accomplishment and joy. They feel important when they can do things that they know are going to push your buttons and then gaslight you right to your face, and doing it right in front of you and gaslight you right to your face. It's no wonder that especially a child being raised up under circumstances with a parent like that, at least we as adult people, even young adult people, we have exposure to other kinds of behaviors to know, this isn't quite right. But for a child, it is completely right because it's all that they know. And I think it's important that we recognize the connections, because so many sibling survivors, as I call them, survivors of narcissistic family systems, end up married to these individuals because of those reasons. Like, I think that people lose sight of the fact that they were children being growing up under these circumstances with no other examples of what was good and what was not good. But for the fact, like with your children, they had you, but with a lot of other of these family systems, they don't have one healthy parent, or even a parent who's striving to be healthy to show them something different, right?
Yeah. And, like with my parents, like my parents are both still alive. And I'm really close in particular to my father. And sometimes I wonder, how did I end up in this situation? But looking back, I think the way, I grew up in the 70s. And so the way the families were, it was more, I think, authoritarian. We're like, we're all going to do this. We're all going to go to like a Chinese restaurant and order this dish. And so I think I never had a lot of choices. It was sort of giving, there was an authority, and I just wasn't able to question. It's not like now, how, at least how I raised my children, I think how society is, where kids' feelings matter more. It was just very like, this is how things are. And I think that dynamic I took into this relationship, first of all, by never thinking what I wanted and letting myself be led in by this a little bit older man, and then just kind of letting myself be led in the relationship without really ever considering, like, is this what I want? Is this what I don't want? Because it was familiar to just be led.
Yeah. Well, and when you add to that the push and pull and the up and down of our hormones and what's happening in our brain, you're not only stopping considering what you want, or not even looking at it in the first place, as that's how you grew up, but you become hyper focused on the reactions of the other person to such a degree that it doesn't even become a consideration anymore. You lose complete sight of yourself because you're trying to make this thing work with someone that you don't realize it's never going to work because of who they are and because of what they bring to the table, right? And what they
My
bring to the table.
Right. My ex always used to say, I mean, he was like a very depressed individual. And he always used to say that the reason he was depressed was because I didn't make him happy, because he was unhappy in the relationship and it was my responsibility. And I remember trying to do exercises with him with like things that make people happy. Like, what are things that, just, and he'd be like, no, it's you and it's sex and you have to do things a certain way and nothing else makes me happy. And it's your fault that I'm unhappy. So I just kept trying harder and harder and harder because I blame myself.
Yeah. I'm sorry that it's awful, right? I'm sorry that you went through that.
It's fine now. I'm way happier
Yeah,
now. So I don't
I
feel,
get it. I get it, right?
Yeah, I
Uh,
do.
what was the breaking point? Like, when did you know that you needed to get out? When were you done?
Very, very clearly. When in 2013, so like I said, our house, I felt like everything was always really messy, like physically messy. And so he agreed to finally clean out part of the attic, and he and my son were doing it, carried down this big bin of some of his stuff to a lower area of the house that he was moving his office. And so he also used to go out on errands all the time that would take way longer than they should have. I think back, I can imagine what he was doing, but he was supposedly getting an oil change. So he was gone for like 2.5 hours. And as I was walking past this bin of overflowing papers, I found a picture of what to me looked like an adolescent girl. It was not like a overtly sexual, but it was this like a screenshot of a girl kind of looking into the camera slightly seductively, and something in me, there were two pictures similar. Something in me was like, oh my God, like you feel it. You don't know why, but you just feel like something is really wrong. And I was a high school English teacher. This person looked like just maybe around my student's age or a little bit older. My ex was 50 at the time. And so I called him and said, what is this? I found these like printout. What is this? And he's like, paused, and he said, well, I've been getting into my art lately and I'm just printing pictures off the internet. And I just knew he was lying. When you feel that sick, like acid feeling, like, how could this person who loves me lie to me? And he just kept, going around it. And I kept saying, I know you're not telling me the truth. Just please tell me the truth, because I just feel so sick. Then finally he said, all right, so this is my girlfriend. I met her online. She lives in Germany, and she's my soulmate. I met her on Spotify. I'm trying to figure out what to do. I'm thinking of moving her to America. I'm kind of torn, and yeah, so there it is. And I was like, what? I mean, we had 2 kids, a tween and a teen. Here's this random person that he admits he's never met, who looks my kid's age, that he's talking about moving to America in one of his dad's apartments. And I was like, well, what about the kids? And he's like, I don't know. I'll figure that out. And that for me was like, we are done. Because in my head, one of the things I always respected was his judgment. I thought, okay, he would joke about me as the traveler, like, oh, you just like to flit about, and I'm the one who's more logical, and I'm the grown up in the relationship, which he really wasn't, but he positioned himself that way. And for him to be so delusional and to admit to some online thing with clearly, like, who even knows what? I mean, most basic people know that people online in these relationships are not real. Everybody, or not everybody, but a lot of people have seen the series Catfish or know the phrase about catfishing. And I just thought, how could he be so stupid? Like, is he out of his mind? And then I just was sort of astonished. And when he got back, he's like, well, I love her and I love you too. And I got to figure out what to do. And I was just like, I can't even process what's going on. And he said, I'm going to go back to therapy. I'm going to go back to the therapist from the beginning of the marriage. And